All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Marcia Cleos. I'm the president of the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Antiemet Sisterhood. That's a mouthful. And tonight is our first in the series of 3 educational programs put together by the Genius Education Committee of Helene Nee, Susan Winter, and Cindy Brotman. So I'm going to turn this over to Helene, who's going to introduce our speaker, and we'll get this show on the road.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I am honored to present Rabbi Debra Orenstein as our speaker on the topic of human trafficking. Rabbi Orenstein is the co-founder of the Passover Project with Free the Slaves. And as many of you will learn, that human trafficking is another word for slavery. Rabbi Debra is passionate about ending slavery in our lifetime, and she has devoted much effort to supporting the work of rescue, rehabilitation, and prevention of human slavery. Rabbi Debra Orenstein is a graduate of Princeton University, summa cum laude, and a 7th-generation rabbi. She's an alumna of the first entering class to include women as rabbinical students at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Rabbi Orenstein is the author and editor of 6 books, including the Lifestyle Book Series, a series of books addressing Jewish life cycle events from a woman's perspective. For 20 years, she was an instructor at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. In 2010, Rabbi Debra returned to our home state of New Jersey, and she has been the spiritual leader of Congregation B'nai Israel in Emerson, New Jersey. In January 2020, she was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Jewish Theological Seminary for her years of service to the Jewish community. She has been named one of America's most inspiring rabbis by the Jewish Forward. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Rabbi Debra Orenstein.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the committee, and I'm so glad to be with you. I want to jump right into our topic by telling you the story of how I came to be involved with slavery and human trafficking. I owe my interest in freeing slaves to conservative Judaism, actually. About 7 years ago, I was called by someone I knew with whom I'd worked on the Social Action Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly. And I was asked to write a sample sermon for rabbis for high holidays about human trafficking. And my initial response was, that's a terrible idea. I could think of 100 better topics for high holidays. I was convinced that if I were to take the trouble to actually write a sermon on human trafficking, it would go unused because people will want to speak about the great themes of the high holidays, like repentance or forgiveness, or they'd focus on key prayers like Yizkor or Kol Nidre. So I pushed back and I offered to write on a different topic. I offered to write on the same topic at a different time, but my colleagues were adamant and they said, nope, this is the topic, this is the time. We need a yes or a no. So I wanted to be a good rabbinic citizen, and I said yes. And I had no expectation that anybody would actually ever deliver this sermon. At this point, like Helene was talking about before we started tonight, I was certainly aware of human trafficking. I knew that there was still slavery in the world, but I had not delved into the topic. So in order to write the sample sermon, I did some reading. And I recall the very first book I read was by E. Benjamin Skinner. It's impressively researched, it's beautifully written, and I could barely stand to read it. The title of the book is A Crime So Monstrous. And the material really was monstrous. It was disgusting. It was obscene. It was violent. It was so tough to read. And I was just arrested by the stories and the language in Skinner's book. He described encounters with slaves and slaveholders. I remember in particular the trafficking of one mentally disabled young woman who was traded for a rusted out car. Human beings were sold into prostitution and into hard labor in slave quarries for as little as $40 each. Went on to read a lot of books by Kevin Bales and others. One of the titles of Kevin Bales' book says it all: Disposable People. After confronting these first-hand accounts, I found that I just could not look away. I don't know if anyone else used that sermon that I wrote as a sample sermon, but I spoke on human trafficking on that high holidays. And for the next 3 years that followed, I spoke and dedicated at least one full sermon to human trafficking. After Yom Kippur that first year, I sat with my husband and my kids, as I usually do after the high holidays, to discuss our experiences over the days of awe. Being a pulpit rabbi, I don't get to sit with them or to discuss with them as the service happens. My daughter was then 7 and my son was 9. And I told them that my big takeaway from the high holidays that year was I wanted to find some way to free 18 people. I wanted to have a direct hand in helping to liberate people. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but that was my goal. And my daughter said, 18 people. 18 is for Chai, that means life. I get it. But why just 18? Why not 100? Now, to a 7-year-old, 100 might as well be a billion. It's the biggest number there is. And with that challenge from that moment on, I realized I would have to think very big. I consider my daughter, my synagogue, and the Rabbinical Assembly, as well as Women's League, to be my allies and my partners in freeing slaves today. Now, tonight, I am going in the time that we have together to share information about modern day slavery, also called human trafficking. I'll share inspiration about the beauty and relevance of our tradition in relation to the problems of slavery today. But beyond information or inspiration, my hope for tonight is really transformation. I hope that in the course of this evening, you will have your own aha moment. I pray that this material will touch you personally and beckon to you so that you use it and you apply your time and your talent and even your money to help free today's slaves as a Jew. There is no greater gift of transformation than freedom. I'm going to see if I can share my screen now and take you through. No, I'm still disabled.
Let me try making you the host.
Good.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Should do it.
Yay.
And I'm going to, excuse me, I'm just getting to, there we go. I'm just going to go to the very beginning and walk you through some slides and some information. Title of our session for tonight, Human Trafficking, a Jewish Perspective. And you'll see artwork by Nyla Pouzin throughout. She's an artist from New Jersey, full disclosure, also my first cousin. And she took photographs of slaves and added some of her own artistry to them. And her artwork appears throughout this presentation in some of the materials that I prepared for Free the Slaves. These are pictures of some of what I was talking about in my personal journey, A Crime So Monstrous, the book that influenced me. There are my kids with their sign for their lemonade stand to free the slaves. It says Jews freeing slaves. And my daughter sold some of her clothes online so that she could raise money to free slaves. Well, I'd like to begin by asking everyone to type in the chat, what do you think of when you think of a slave? Just go ahead if you have the chat available and type something in. You might think of slaves in the ancient world. You might think about a date when slavery ended, presumably 1865 in the United States, if you think of it that way. At least it ended on the books. Or you might think about who is enslaved today. And I'm just going to look at my chat and see some of the answers. Oh, let's see. It's a little hard for me. Maybe somebody else could read from the chat. What are some of the answers? Helene, can I ask you to do that? You're muted, Helene.
Okay, I have here terrifying. Someone working against their will. Day laborers, fruit pickers, people being held without their consent, someone who has no control over their destiny, sex slavery, people in an abusive relationship, prisoners, someone held against their will and has no freedom, people unable to control their lives.
Wow, what a disturbing and beautiful set of answers. Thank you. And now I want to apply some numbers to it. You can see as we define the problem today, it is all the things that were said in the chat. When we think about the numbers, the scope of the problem, the estimates from the International Labor Organization now are that there are about 40 million people enslaved today, more than have ever been enslaved in the world before. And yet there's hope, as we will talk about going forward. Now, I say it's an estimate because, of course, slavery is a crime that happens in the shadows. So we don't have exact counts. Think about how we do our own census in the United States. It's hard to get a count that's completely accurate, even when you're doing it out in the open. But also the disputes emerge about the counting based on who is classified as a slave. If you look in the center of your slide, you see 37.5% of slavery victims today are in forced marriage slavery. That used to not even be considered a category. Girls and young women who were forced into marriage were not considered slaves until quite recently. So if you count them, then the number goes up. If you don't count them, the number goes down. Likewise for child soldiers who are sometimes counted as slaves and sometimes not. But in this counting, 71% of the slavery victims today are women and girls because of the high amount of forced marriage. We tend to think in this country primarily about sex slavery and sex trafficking when we think about human trafficking, but worldwide it's only about 12.5%. 50% of slaves are in labor slavery, meaning that they might serve on a farm or in a quarry or in a factory, but also in restaurants or nail salons or hotels or in domestic servitude. There are countless ways that people are deprived of their freedom, unfortunately.
Yeah, and somebody listed in the chat about human trafficking is raised up during major sporting events with demand for sex slaves from attendees at these events taking place in nearby hotels. I know you wrote something about the Super Bowl.
Yes, when the Super Bowl came to New Jersey, I think it was in 2014 or 2015, the New Jersey human trafficking group took a large interest, and the Federation took a large interest, and my synagogue, myself personally, all took an interest in providing for some of the women who were trafficked to New Jersey. And we distributed soaps to the hotels with special 800 numbers that they could call. Some of you may have been part of that effort, but it sadly does attach to sporting events. Very true. I'm going to just play so we have a sense of hearing not just about slaves, but from them. I'm going to play a few minutes.
They offer us fabulous jobs, but they lie. The boss didn't give us any food. We were hungry every day.
There was a demand for me to service 20 to 30 customers. I was sick and shaking, but I had to service customers. The brothel owner threatened if I don't go into the room, I will be killed.
A man came into our village and told us there was good work available and that we'd be paid well. He told us to come work with him, but when we went there, all we got were beatings. We were beaten all the time.
We know it's dangerous work because sometimes a big storm may come and cover the hole where you are working and kill you. I know one boy who died.
They told my mom they would send me to school. I left home thinking I would be sent to school. It was a lie.
The slaveholder hired men armed with guns and axes, and they guarded us the entire day.
I was kept in chains. That was the most fearful part for me. We were dragged around by the chains. My leg used to bleed because of the chains.
A bonded laborer has to work as a slave to the master. He has no freedom. He is totally at the mercy of the landlord. Working like this, there is no difference between an animal and a human being.
I think it's important.
Greetings from the Passover Project.
We'll talk about this more later, but I think it's very important to discuss not slavery by hearing from former slaves and amplifying their voices. Now, looking at the last number of pictures and videos, you might be forgiven for thinking that slavery only happens in places where they don't speak English or slavery isn't here. But we can see that slavery happens all over the world, and including in New Jersey. New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking is represented here tonight. And you may have seen some of these signs up and down the turnpike and the parkway. Maybe you saw this story of a 22 charged in a prostitution ring that included human trafficking here in Bergen County. There's unfortunately no shortage of stories. It's not just far away. Similarly, this happens in Israel as well. Now, I've been in touch regularly with Atsum. Their website says that there are 2,500 women a year illegally entering Israel as sex slaves. But in truth, that number has gone down a bit because of their good work. However, unfortunately, other people are trafficked in from elsewhere to fill the gaps. And in addition, there's labor slavery in Israel. Remember that there are 180,000 migrant workers in Israel. And today there's exactly one person in law enforcement working to protect their rights. Happily, you can support Atsum or Kav La'oved, two excellent social service organizations and advocacy organizations in Israel who are working to change all that. So I've given you a lot of depressing information. Now I want to give you a little bit of hope so you know it's possible to make a difference. There is a problem here that can be solved. We have so many problems. We're talking about COVID at the beginning. What can you and I do to stop the spread? Well, there are personal responsibility measures, but really and truly, who knows when it will be over? We feel out of control with many problems. Many problems seem so large, it's hard to imagine how they'll be tackled. There is a plan and there is a path for freeing today's slaves. This problem can be solved in the near term. In fact, in its sustainability goals, the United Nations has resolved that, and 200 countries have signed on to the proposition that human trafficking can be ended by the year 2030. That's not very far away. So I'm hopeful now that the United Nations and many, many signatory countries, including the United States, have agreed that this is a goal, that we can get there. The Catholic Church has accepted it as a goal. The Rabbinical Assembly last year accepted it as a goal, and there are paths to get there. Not only is this a profound and important goal, but it fulfills the Jewish story and mission. I'm sure we all know the story of Passover. The central narrative of the Jewish people is to go from slavery to freedom, and that we could help others do the same is the fulfillment of our history and destiny. There's also a motivation because this is a topic that all Jews can get behind. How many topics can we say that about? There's so much division within the Jewish community. Here we have true unity. Not only is the conservative movement committed to this goal, but the Orthodox Union, the Reform movement, Jewish Renewal, and the Reconstructionist movement all list the ending of human trafficking in their top 3 social justice goals. We have unity, and it's wonderful that we can work together. This is also an opportunity to reach out to unaffiliated or alienated Jews who may say, how is Judaism relevant? Well, this is how. This is a big reason that Judaism is relevant today. It's certainly not the only reason. I think Judaism speaks to all of us in countless ways. But when we look at the world, we say, how can I help? This is a way that Judaism is profoundly relevant, addressing human trafficking and ending slavery in our lifetimes. We can also connect to other faith traditions around this issue. I've represented the Jewish community at the Freedom from Slavery Forum for 2 or 3 years. And when I have been there, I've connected with the Latter-day Saints, with the Catholic Church, with Baha'i activists. We all share this in common. It's a wonderful way to bring peace among and between people. We have the opportunity to exercise leadership on this important social justice issue. And we can realize a double mitzvah. First of all, helping vulnerable people, and then doing it visibly as a Jew. I see there's a hand raised. Carol, did you want to ask something or share something? Please unmute. Maybe Carol pressed her button by mistake. I'm going to continue. Carol, if you have something to add, you'll stop me. So this week's Torah portion is B'Shalach, the defining moment in the narrative of Jewish freedom when we cross the sea. What may surprise you is all the other Torah portions that are up on the screen, each and every one of which deals in some significant way with the issue of slavery. It's not just in the Exodus narrative, it's in our laws, it's in our ethics, it's in other stories, it's all over the Torah. In fact, this is the list of Torah portions that do not deal with slavery in some way. You can see that the weight is much heavier toward the Torah portions that do deal. Now, the commandment most often repeated in the Torah is the commandment regarding the stranger. And according to the Talmud, depending on how you count, it could be as few as 36 times or as much as 46 times. Now, 36, as my daughter, the 7-year-old, pointed out, would be double chai, double life. It's also the number of righteous who uphold the world in Jewish numerology. If you look at the number 46 in Jewish numerology, the Aleph counts as 1, the Mem as 40, the Hey as 5. That means female slave. Uma, same spelling, different vocalization, is a nation. And the word Ema means terror, all of which connect to slavery. And throughout the Torah, in the various iterations, we have all kinds of mitzvot. Do not wrong a stranger, do not oppress a stranger, love the stranger as yourself, do not subvert the rights of the stranger who resides with you shall be as one of your citizens. When you liberate someone, do not send him away from you empty-handed. All of these different mitzvot around the stranger have the same conclusion. The ... the ellipses on your page are filled in exactly the same way. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has a beautiful teaching about this. He says, you have been oppressed, therefore you shall come to the rescue of the oppressed, whoever they are. You have suffered, therefore you shall become the people who are there to offer help when others are suffering. This is the message of Torah, a message of compassion, that your terrible experience should lead to some greater kindness and greater good. Now, it's not just in the Torah, of course, but in the prophets that we champion freedom. We have on Yom Kippur in our central Torah reading, Isaiah's injunction that God's fast is not just about not eating. It's about justice, untying the cords of the yoke, letting the oppressed go free, breaking off every yoke. Elsewhere, Isaiah talks about bringing freedom to the captives and liberation to the imprisoned. And Jeremiah talks in a negative way about people who said they would free and release their indentured servants after 6 years, but then went back and tried to re-enslave them. And about them, God says, I proclaim your freedom and release to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine. God has no patience for slaveholders. Now, we say on Yom Kippur, our most important Haftorah of the year, that we're committed to freedom, but also 3 times a day in the Amidah, we talk about Matir Asurim, God sets the prisoners free, and it's based on a verse from Psalms that talks about God watching over strangers. Again, love the stranger. You know the soul of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, all this would be enough in terms of Jewish imperatives against slavery, but there's even more. We have the mitzvah to pursue justice, not to steal or kidnap. We have the mitzvah not to stand idly by the blood of another, so that we don't tolerate others doing violence. We value people equally and infinitely according to the very opening of our Torah and our creation. We practice respect and dignity for all of whom God made. There is a specific rabbinic language around including non-Jews in your tzedakah, mipnei darkei shalom, that we pave paths of peace by helping non-Jews. And of course, there is the mitzvah to redeem captives. Now, in the Bible, it's arguable that perhaps redeeming captives, in rabbinic literature rather, redeeming captives applied primarily to Jews, but it certainly applies to others as well. And Maimonides, the great 12th century rabbi, wrote about this. There is no greater mitzvah for you than redeeming captives. For an individual held captives falls under the category of the hungry, the thirsty, and the unclothed, and is also in mortal danger. Those who look away transgress many positive and negative commandments, and there is no more extensive mitzvah, mitzvah rabbah, for you than redeeming captives. The very, very strong language from Maimonides, even stronger in the Shulchan Aruch, the 16th century Jewish law code that says, every moment that you delay in freeing captives, in cases where it is possible to expedite their freedom, it is as if you are shedding blood. So I'm just going to quickly mention that it's not only our mitzvah to redeem the captives, to be kind to the stranger, to make sure that the stranger is not oppressed. It's also God's priority and even God's identity. I've come to rescue you, to lift you up out of slavery. If you remember, the Passover Haggadah traces the 4 cups of wine and even the 4 children and the 4 questions back to the 4 verbs in Exodus of freedom. I am Adonai. I will remove you. I will save you. I will redeem you. I will take you to me. And I will, in the end, I, Adonai, am your God who is removing, present tense, you from under the sufferings of Egypt. So it's not just that God did something way back when for us in ancient history, but God is continually lifting off the burden of slavery from us. And it's our duty to do the same for others. If we don't, God says, I will surely heed their cry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth. God says not just that the stranger shall have the rights of the citizens and that you should love the stranger, but ends it with, I am Adonai your God. This is who I am. This is what I ask of you. And of course, we say in the Shema, I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, Adonai, am your God. There is a strong, strong connection between freedom and divinity. And we see it most prominently in the first of the 10 commandments. I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. This is the introduction to the 10 commandments, but this is also an introduction to who God is, God's very identity. And so far, I've talked a lot about the Jewish commitment and the divine commitment to freedom. So I want to turn now to some very practical connections between Jewish historical experience with slavery and slaves today. Let's talk about bricks. There's a beautiful and terrible moment when Moses first speaks to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And Moses is full of hope for the Exodus. And he confronts what it means to live under tyranny. Because rather than relenting or listening to reason or paying attention to signs and wonders, Pharaoh instead doubles down. He is infuriated by the desire for freedom. And so rather than relenting, he now requires not only that the Jews make bricks, but that they collect their own straw. And there on the right picture, you can see mud bricks made from topsoil and straw, as the Jews used to do. And Pharaoh says, as for the quota of bricks that was imposed upon the slaves formerly, do not reduce it now that I have forced them to find their own materials to make bricks. For they are shirkers near Pimham. And that is why they cry out, saying, let us go and sacrifice to our God. So there's no acknowledgement of the human physical need or the human spiritual need. They don't need the straw. They don't need the prayer. They don't need anything. They just have to do Pharaoh's bidding. Let's see how that plays out today.
भट्ठा पर लेके चल कर ली दबर की मड़ैया फूक के ढकेल दे दबर के कुल सर समारा वही फेंक दे जर जा मैंने इनका आज छूट गई नहीं तब ना जाद में भैली ना तो बड़ी परेशानी बड़ी दुर्गत कैली है मधुआर अली मैंने तब के मारतो पीटतो रहा साहेब तो हमने केहू से न पाई हम हनों के गोल में कर आदमी मर गए नहीं ये खर्चा खर्चा घटवा मार
The nature of Brooklyn is such that people who are working there are entirely in slavery. And the reason for this is that this whole industry is controlled by violence and threat.
हमारा बेटा हमारे भाई के थोक के चटलना ऑफिस में बंद पे साहब वही डर के मिले हमने वहाँ से चले 4-5 साल काम वहाँ कर रहे हैं 4 महीना के 5 महीना थे वो तो हम लोग नहीं भागे थे बाकी हमारी पत्नी का ढेर बहुत हालत खराब हो गया था सीरियस हो गया था वो तो पैसा मांगे नहीं मिला फिर गाड़ी आए सब मारे पीटे
This is all illegal. They probably know, but they don't have the courage to come out of it until MSCMVS field workers reach to them. And that is the time when they start realizing how they can change their situation.
MSCMVS basically believes in rescue, rehabilitation, and reintegration, along with the prevention, prosecution, and conviction of the slaveholders and traffickers. It creates community vigilance committees in the vulnerable communities. During the Community Vigilance Committee, most of the survivors and the community members discuss about their basic issues, their local agenda, the kind of cases they have been reported. This Kukraha CVC identified many cases of slavery in victims themselves. Kukraha CVC has rescued more than 1,000 people till date. And this all was possible because of their belief that they can achieve self-sustained liberation, which is ultimately the model of MSC-MBS.
The whole approach of these slaves and the partners is not to just free them, but to sustain the freedom. We do not give any high dreams or big dreams to the communities who are freed, because we want them to have those dreams and then realize them. And the CVC in the village wanted to realize their dream of being an owner of their own bricklet. And they came up with idea together. They started from one brick.
बहुत अंतर भैया, बहुत अंतर है कि ये तो घर का बात है ना, घर के मामले में हम लोग काम कर रहे हैं जमकर। सोच रहे हैं कि बाल बच्चे की भी सुखी से जैसे हम लोग अब से मतलब कि सुख से है तो आगे भी चल के सुख से रह जाए।
हम लोग को बहुत अच्छा लगा था, मतलब और 2-4 लोग के लिए आँखें कटा लेते और अच्छा लगे।
हम लोग के माने यही रखता है कि हम लोग ये राम जानकी जैसे वो लोग जोड़े हैं तैसे जोड़ी पर सब पात रहे थे।
दिल्ली में मकान बनावल जाए, अपन करल खा जाए।
सर इसलिए हम लोग कहीं से आगे बढ़े।
हमारे बदे ईटा का मतलब बहुत आजाद बा।
I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I want to see if anyone would like to just type in the chat or raise a virtual hand or a real hand. Let's see if I can see, and you'll unmute and share a reaction to that video. Lena,
Frightening.
Say it again, Marcia.
So that it's enlightening but frightening. You know, and it's a lot of, I never even thought about it, to be very honest. So it's very disturbing.
What's particularly disturbing to me is this, I take it so personally. Here we, so many thousands of years ago, were slaves making bricks, and still in the world there are slaves making bricks. Just it's so unacceptable. Any other reactions? Yes, I see somebody said it's lovely to see their smiling faces. Isn't that an amazing transformation? They're doing the same work. It looks hot. It doesn't look like they have great wealth, but they're so happy to be doing the work for themselves, to be free. Did you notice that little moment when she takes a bit of clay and sticks it on her child's head and just fooling around and smiling? Yes, please, Meryl, I see a hand.
Yeah, it looked like there was Hebrew written on some of the bricks. Was it Hebrew or was I just imagining?
No, it was Indian language.
Oh, okay, because some of them look like Hebrew, I think.
A different alphabet, definitely, not an English alphabet. So, all right, well, I'm going to thank you for your responses and your questions about that too. I'm going to go back to our slides because I want to continue up, not with this particular slide, but hang on, let's see if I can get onto my next slide, and I will share with you in just a moment. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to again share my screen for just a minute. Here we go. So there are elements in how slaves are freed, some of which you saw in that video. First of all, there has to be prosecution of the slave holders. You might remember the very first slide, it said that there are $150 billion earned, estimated annually, by slave traders. The United States government spends about 150 million. So we're going to have to do some good prosecution and show some real consequences in order to dissuade people from this sadly lucrative business. We also need to protect vulnerable populations. There are people who may know intellectually this is illegal, but if they don't see any recourse, if they're being held in chains, if they're being threatened, if they're being made to lick up the spit of the slaveholder who's threatening them, then they're going to need some concrete protections. We have to address the needs in a particular condition and locality. That's a brilliant piece of Kevin Bale's work in his book, Ending Slavery, and in the organization that he founded, Free the Slaves. It's really targeted. It may be that what works in one area doesn't work in another. Sometimes immigration affects how different people can be best freed. Sometimes caste or race plays a role. Sometimes gender plays a role. Sometimes there are local customs that you have to take account of. So it really matters what's going on, what makes people vulnerable in a particular area. And then we have to think about our products. We don't always think about the supply chain of how things get to us, but there are many products that use slave labor, which we enjoy. Favorite example of mine is chocolate, because estimates are that about 70% of the cocoa beans picked today in the world are picked by slaves, which means if you don't buy fair trade chocolate, if you just buy generic brand chocolate that has no assurances, chances are it was picked by slaves, and very often by child slaves. We don't ask, where did my brick come from? But it's a good question to ask. We have to think about prevention. Those community meetings that they held, where people were empowered and given information and given support, that prevented people from falling into slavery in the first place, as well as providing comfort and rehabilitation for the people who had been slaves. Free the Slaves are really wonderful at figuring out particular conditions and localities that are vulnerable, and then creating a prevention plan of education and community organizing. The last P, and probably the most important from a spiritual point of view, is personhood. Do we really see these slaves as human beings? Because as soon as we do, then we want to act. So this is just another way of saying the same thing. People need access to justice, whether it's through the local police, through the courts, through laws of the land. We need corporate accountability for the products that we create and how that we use and how they're created. And we need community empowerment. If someone doesn't have any access to capital and has to borrow from loan sharks, that can lead to debt bondage. If someone doesn't have any access to food or healthcare, that can lead them to sacrifice their freedom. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the resources that are available from the Rabbinical Assembly. First is a one-pager for general distribution. I'm talking a lot tonight. I'm giving you a lot of information, but there's just a single, simple one-pager that you can share with people that will explain there is a problem of slavery in the world. There's a reason Jews care about it. Here are a few things you can do. We also have a one-pager for social justice committees and clergy and other leaders who may want to do a deeper dive. Just last year, or no, 2 years ago now, in the pandemic, time flies, March 2020, good time to publish a book. The Rabbinical Assembly published a book called No More Slaves. I was privileged to edit it, and it provides curriculum and guidance for involving youth in ending slavery. And this is a little bit of a direction of how to get to the Rabbinical Assembly website, but I'm going to show it to you. There's their 5-minute video there tailored to the Rabbinical Assembly. And I'm just going to stop my screen share so that for a moment, you'll be able to see the website itself. I'll show it to you so you'll be able to access. I thought I was showing it to you so you'll be able to access. Let's see. Here we are. Is that? Yeah. So here's the Rabbinical Assembly. You go under Tzedek Justice, and you can see slavery and human trafficking, and then human trafficking guide and one-pagers. And if you click on any of these, for example, right here, you'll see the beginning of the one-pager. And you can print it out, you can download it, you can share it with others in your sisterhood, in your community, at a model seder, etc. I'm going to go back and show you a few more resources before we conclude. Let's see. I want to show you some resources from Free the Slaves. First, just as a quick review, who they are. They were pioneers and innovators, as I mentioned, founded by Kevin Bale. They work locally using local people, many of whom have had direct experience, unfortunately, with human trafficking. They are big global influencers. They've been involved with the United Nations, with the nonprofit groups called Alliance 8.7, those people who are committed to the sustainability goal that says we'll end human trafficking by the year 2030. They convene the Freedom from Slavery Forum, which brings all the different anti-trafficking organizations together on an annual basis. They're community focused. They go village by village, really taking account of local conditions. And they're committed not just to liberating individual people, but to changing the conditions that allow slavery to persist. So these are some of the things that you can find from them. On the right-hand side, you'll see various resources that are available. The Passover Project is a kind of a subsidiary of Free the Slaves. It's Jews working with Free the Slaves to connect past slavery in our history to slavery today. The Passover Project works on educating and mobilizing Jewish communities and provides lots of free downloadable resources on the Free the Slaves website for Passover, for Hanukkah, for Shabbat, for classes, for events. And it's a simple website to remember, freetheslaves.net/Judaism. So specific resources you can find there, a 5-minute video, Passover coupons, just half a page, that give people a tiny bit of information. It's easy kind of invitation to learn more. There's something called Seder Starters that I'm going to show you that curates materials that you can use at Seders. There's a curriculum for every grade from kindergarten through adult education called Next Year Free. And all of that is available at freetheslaves.net. So let me just show you that very quickly so you can have access. Right here, I hope you see on your screens, there's a Faith in Action page. Notice the Donate Now button. That's an important button because when you click it, you get to a page that allows you to donate as a Jew. Going back, you can see the resource of the 5-minute video that you can play for yourself or share with others. And I wanted to show you the Seder Starters because I think this is such a valuable resource. Here we see the artwork of Nyla Puzin based on real photographs of real slaves. And you can see in the table of contents, we begin with multi-part segments and full-length Haggadot that focus on modern slavery. And then after that, we go in order of the Seder. So you have items to place on your Seder table, opening prayers, and then in the order of the, what do you do for the Kiddush? What do you do for the washing of hands, for the parsley, for the breaking of the matzah, and so on through the entire order of the Seder. You can have readings, activities, handouts, suggestions for all sorts of interactive conversations and resources that go beyond even what you might use at your Seder, but give to people for after the Seder. Now, I wanted to just share with you some of what Passover Project has done in the past. We, one year, purchased a rescue boat for Ghana. Children are routinely trafficked on Lake Volta in Ghana. And by having a rescue boat, it made it easier for the workers in Ghana to confront some of the traffickers and to free some children. There's domestic servitude in Haiti. There's a tradition called Restavik. You can see in this picture on the right, someone going door to door and talking in Haiti. The Restavik tradition said that children would be sent away to an aunt or an uncle to live with them when they were slightly older, maybe to go to school in a different town. But it led to indentured servitude, domestic servitude, and cruel slavery, including sexual abuse of children. And so the Free the Slaves had a focus one year on our Passover project to work to end domestic servitude in Haiti and help the survivor network that goes from door to door. Last year, we talked a lot about conscious consumerism at home, whether it's jewelry or food. Here, chocolate is pictured, as I mentioned, or also our clothing that is sometimes made by child slaves in foreign countries. We can do better by demanding to know the supply chain, by questioning when goods are so very cheap, how can they afford to be that cheap? Were people properly paid? This year, for the Passover Project, we're going to be doing a focus on survivors themselves. We say about ourselves as Jews, for you know the soul of a stranger, having been strangers in the land of Egypt. Well, survivors of today do know the soul of a stranger. They have been those slaves and those strangers and those survivors. So we are intending to provide them with vocational training and small business startup funding, help them to continue to develop survivor advocacy networks. Some are in place and they need more support. Some need to be created, give people the tools to gather together and to have support groups for one another, and then to advocate for slaves. And finally, it's important to amplify the voices of survivors as witnesses, as experts, and as leaders. You think about them being witnesses. That's not just in a court case. They can bear witness to what goes on in secret. They are experts because they know how they and maybe others in their community have been trafficked. They know what the vulnerabilities are, and they can and should be leaders in the fight for freedom. So there's information on the website about what the Passover Project does. 4 essential things. Number 1, education. Through all the different resources of curriculum and handouts and suggestions for fair trade fairs and visiting lecturers and so on, we seek to educate the Jewish community about the problem of slavery today and how and why Jews can address it. We do advocacy. We use the power of the purse for our investments, for our purchases. And finally, we partner with Free the Slaves in terms of giving tzedakah. There's no minimum amount that a Passover Project must give. The average donation turns out to be about $1,000, but it could be the classic chai 18. Any amount to be part of this group of 60 and growing Jewish communities or boards of rabbis or schools that want to help end slavery in our lifetimes. So as a special offer today, I promised that I would ask Free the Slaves to consult with anybody who is on the call today to discuss which programs, which resources might work best for you and your community. There's a lot to curate, there's a lot to understand. So that's an opportunity and an invitation to you. I've given a lot of references, so I just want to say on my website, rabbidebra.com, there's a button called Freeing Slaves. You can look there. And you can also go to the Rabbinical Assembly and to freetheslaves.net/Judaism. So to conclude today, I want to ask you to type in the chat your takeaways. Is there something that struck you that you learned that you didn't know before? Maybe just an image of one particular person who spoke on one of the videos or a statistic. And also, is there something that you feel moved to do? Is there somebody you want to talk to about this? You want to tell about this? Is there a contribution you want to make in time or in money? What are you thinking about as far as takeaways? What did you learn and what would you like to do? So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people's faces and hear your voices if you'd like to share about that. I know I've thrown a lot at you tonight. Yes, I saw a hand from Susan. Go ahead, please, Susan.
Yes, Rabbi, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And I know that in this limited time, you only scratched the surface. And the work, I think that Jewish values is what keeps many of us going in the coalition, the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And I'm delighted to see some of my colleagues here tonight. I just wanted to add, I put it in the chat, that this month is National Human Trafficking Awareness and Prevention Month, and tomorrow is the National Day. And so we have a lot of programs, a lot of educational programs this coming month, and you can find them in on our website. I put in the chat at safernj.org. And there will be one in February 28th about the supply chain with cotton. And there'll be one in a couple of weeks about how child abuse can lead to human trafficking. And the one final thing to bring it a little bit closer to home is that one of our survivor consultants, when we first started 10 years ago, was a young woman who's a survivor of sex trafficking, whose grandparents were members of their synagogue board. So it's a lot closer to home than you think.
Thank you for sharing that, Susan. That's so important. Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, there's no shortage of ways to plug in and to contribute. And sometimes people really are motivated by what's close to home. And the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking is just a beautiful organization. I've been involved in years past, and my synagogue is a coalition member, delighted to support it. And I think the work you do is so important. I want to just lift up a few comments from the chat. People said they would like to use this information at the Passover service this year with granddaughters ages 5 and 8 who should be aware of this. Looking at who's represented today, I'm wondering how much male participation this gets. Well, fair question, but we are on a women's league call. However, I love it. The Joy's husband wants to share this with the men's club. People are surprised to learn that there is more prevalence of trafficking than they were aware of, and they want to involve Women's League in assisting financially. People talked about how they're glad to understand the parallels to Judaism and our slavery in Egypt. And hopefully you can include some of this information, I see it in the chat, for the Women's Seder next year, in your community Seders, in your personal Seders, in women's Seders, in model Seders, whenever we talk about the book of Exodus, when we talk about Jewish values, loving the stranger, loving your neighbor as yourself, it's always a good day to talk about it. And this month, Human Trafficking Month, is especially important. So I'm going to call your attention to one last thing. And that was on our last slide. You may have noticed from Rabbi Tarfon the famous quote, "You are not obligated to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it." And here we have the statement, don't be overwhelmed. You don't have to do this by yourself. No one person can do the work and the task of ending slavery alone. We have partners and partnership, but neither are you ben chorim, or we would say bat chorim, benot chorim. Neither are you free to desist from it. And isn't it interesting that it uses the word free? If we want to be spiritually free, we have to commit to the physical freedom of others. I hope that you'll stay in touch with me. I hope that we'll get together for other good and holy causes, for simchas. And I wanted to share with you that there is a Misha Berach for survivors of human trafficking. I'm going to end with that. And then I'll be happy to stay on and chat and answer any questions. We started a little late, so I'm happy to stay on a little bit late. Mishaberach Avotenu v'Imotenu Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah Hu yivarech et achinu kol yoshvei tevel asher chayahem nug'u mishibud b'yameinu v'yotziam me'afela le'ora. May the one who blessed all our ancestors, including Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless all those whose lives have been touched and marred by modern day slavery, and bring them from darkness into light. May it be your will, Judge of all the world, that you send redemption to the millions of your creations who are enslaved today, and complete healing of soul and body to those who have survived trafficking. May the Eternal send them strength and bless them with peace, that they may rebuild their lives. Therefore, we will work with you to establish a world under divine sovereignty, so no person will exploit or oppress another. As the prophet wrote, Lo v'chayil v'lo v'choach, ki im beruchi amar Adonai tzvaot. Not by might and not by power, but by my spirit, declares Adonai of hosts. And let us say, Amen.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much, Rabbi Orenstein, for this amazing presentation. I don't know if anybody has any other questions or issues that they want to bring up. I mean, I know that it certainly was very eye-opening, you know, for us, and to create this awareness and understanding, you know, and then realize, yes, there is something we can do about it, you know, that we're not helpless, and if we can join together, that we really could accomplish great things. And I know even on a more local level, even in New Jersey, because I know the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking is here, and they are also, you know, people that are very, very involved in this very important topic. And then I want to also just let people know that this is the first in our series of programs on women and social justice. Hope that you'll join us on Monday, January 31st, where we discuss another important topic of domestic violence, a Jewish perspective, where we'll be welcoming Debra Rosenblum, who's the head of Jewish Women International, who's going to be discussing this very vital topic.
Very interesting topics, as always.
Okay, stay tuned.
I do have a question. I reclaimed the host. Where are you, Deborah? Oh, there you are. Okay.
I'm still here.
So just so I could stop the recording when we needed to. On the videos, there were people talking about how they got into the slavery. Somebody came and told us that our children would get an education, and, you know, all the different ways that they kind of got into this. Is that generally how it's done?
It's a great question. Thank you. Probably the number one vulnerability is migration. When people are moving from place to place and they don't have a support system, they're even more vulnerable to trafficking. So many of the women, let's say, who were trafficked into Israel, into sex slavery, or into the United States in sex slavery, came here because there was a coyote or somebody who promised them a good job at the other end, who was going to help them immigrate and then put them into a role of a slave. That's the number one way today that it happens. And there's so much migration going on this planet now because of climate, because of political unrest and so on, that's a very big deal. But then we have a lot of different individual stories. There are these horrible Sophie's Choice stories where families literally can't feed their children. And somebody comes along and says, I will give your eldest a good education. And they are not sure that it's true. It may not be real, but they take a chance and bet that it's possible because they get the money to feed their other children. So this is where we talk about helping to end slavery in part by eliminating the conditions that allow slavery to exist. If that family had temporary buffer, if they could borrow money, if there was a food pantry they could go to, they wouldn't be vulnerable to being trafficked. And then there are literally people who are kidnapped from their houses. That does happen, or from parties. That's something that happens in the Western world sometimes. It really varies from situation to situation, but there's no shortage of strategies, unfortunately.
I don't even know what to say.
Yeah. Anyone else have questions or thoughts or comments? I'd be delighted to hear from you.
How does one get involved if one wants to get involved?
Well, then the number one way that I would suggest is to become a member of the Passover Project. And as I said, that's a simple email. You go to freetheslaves.net/Judaism. You'll scroll down and it'll say, I'm interested in joining, tell me more. You click on the email, you let them know that you're interested. And because we were here together today, I prevailed upon the wonderful folks at Free the Slaves that they would help anybody who signs on as a Passover partner to curate the resources, to figure out how we want to participate. There are a lot of problems that we can't solve with money. You know, if I could pay to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, I would pay. But I know that money will not solve that problem. This is one of the few problems that if you throw money at it, it will get solved. If there is enough money, we know how to do this. There are enough people working on the ground. There are enough governments committed to ending it. There are enough religious groups who have said they want to do it. There's a plan that I described of all those separate P's, and it will happen. But what's missing are resources. Free the Slaves had to shrink some of their staff over the pandemic because people just had less to give. So I think just giving tzedakah is a perfectly beautiful way to participate. And when you give as a Jew through the Passover Project, it lets people know all around the world, whether they're in India or Haiti or wherever the hot spots are, Congo, it lets them know that Jews cared, that the people of the Bible live up to the Bible. It's a beautiful way of doing a double mitzvah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? If not, then we'll be really thankful to Rabbi Orenstein. And there are a lot of resources that will go out to everyone that has registered for the program. We'll be sure that everyone gets, the list that you gave me, Rabbi Orenstein, and others that we've compiled together.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. It was so nice to meet you and have you speak to us. It was fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And
Thank you for the beautiful program.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Okay,
Shalom.
take care, everybody.